The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second stakeholder webinar hosted by the co-chairs of the Post2020 Global Biodiversity Process and the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. As you know, we have held our first webinar of this series in January, where we discussed the linkages between biodiversity and climate change. And we are delighted to be hosting this second webinar focusing on the sustainable agriculture and food systems transition and nature, linkages to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I'm Jyoti Mathur Philip. I'm the Director of the Implementation Support Division and leading the work in the Secretariat on Post-2020 with the co-chairs, and I will be moderating this panel for you, I hope, well. But now I would like to hand over to the co-chairs of the Post-2020 process. Basil, you have the floor.
Good day to all of you, and thank you, Jyoti. Before I start, I'd like to apologize, and I'll be alone this morning. Francis is not able to join us yet to deal with some family obligation that could not be moved. So, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure to welcome you to this meeting. It's the second of the series, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I will also like to thank the Executive Secretary and the staff from the Secretariat that help us in the preparation. We launched this series in January in response to a call from you, the stakeholders that were telling us that your voice were not sufficiently heard in the new virtual format. In addition, we felt that this webinar provided us with an opportunity to dig down and take some more complex and important subject a little bit further. And therefore, we envisage this forum as a space for mutual learning, a chance to hear from all stakeholders across a wide range of opinion. In this forum, we work a little bit differently than in the official meeting. We give equal opportunity for all stakeholders, both parties and non-parties, to share their views. and we hope to informally explore together with you the many issues of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We've published, as you know, the Global Biodiversity Outlook was released in August, and that provided us with important information on complex issues, and that was also a base for the choice of the subject. I would like to remind participants that this is not a negotiation, but an opportunity to exchange information and increase our knowledge and learn about each other's perspective. I would also like to kindly ask all speakers to limit their statements to 3 minutes to ensure that everyone is given an opportunity to speak. Our webinar today will be the theme of sustainable agriculture, food system, transition, and nature. Linkage to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The nexus between agriculture, food, and biodiversity is incredibly important. It's probably one of the, I would say in my personal view, one of the most important change we face as a global society. A positive one, but a big change. I would like to discuss today or say a few words about the next step. And as we examine the connection between sustainable agriculture and food system and protect the biodiversity worldwide, we will discuss how the proposed global biodiversity frameworks can embrace a food system approach across multiple sectors by unlocking important co-benefits, such as protecting nature we all depend on, supporting resilient farmers' livelihood, more inclusive and sustainable growth, increased health and well-being. To this end, we will explore the role and interdependency of the supply side on the demand side of food production and consumption patterns, and how the frameworks can influence policy areas such as responsible investments, dietary change, and nature-based solutions. We have listened to your feedback from the first webinar and will therefore run things a little bit different this time. We'll begin the webinar with open remarks that will set the context of our discussion: big picture, sustainable agriculture, food system, transition, and nature. This will be followed by concise intervention by 3 invited discussants, representing 3 different stakeholders who will share their perspective on these issues. We hope that this perspective will inspire you or your own thinking and will kickstart a fruitful discussion. After the 3 discussants have spoken, we'll display several focus questions on screen that touch upon issues raised by our presenters. We will then invite all participants to share their views and ask questions guided by the focus question. Finally, allow me to reiterate an important principle. We're here today to listen and to learn and to express ourselves, but not to negotiate. This webinar is not a negotiation session. It is an informal webinar intended to provide the discussion space to educate ourselves, increase knowledge of different perspectives, and improve our understanding of the many complex issues that will help us along our journey toward the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you. We are delighted to have with us today 2 very distinguished experts, and they will give us the scene setting or context setting discussion. I will now like to give the floor to Dr. Alison Blais-Palmer, UNESCO Chair on Food, Biodiversity and Sustainable Studies, and Mrs. Mariam Rahmanian, Co-Chair of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food System, IPBES Food, who will provide us with their insight on the nexus of sustainable agriculture, food system transition, and nature through a joint 10-minute presentation. Dr. Blais-Palmer, Ms. Mariam Rahmanian, you have the floor.
Good day to everyone, and thank you for the chance to share some thoughts about the food system and opportunities for biodiverse sustainable transitions. The food system is extremely complex, as I'm sure you all know. It relies on the environment, including biodiversity, which is literally the basis of life, water and soil, and also includes social well-being, so food security, health, and livelihoods. In addition, it captures the flow of food from farmers' fields to our plates. It's well understood that intensive food production destroys biodiversity. If we take the EU as an example of the long-term consequences of intensive agriculture, the 2019 State of the Environment report determined that agricultural intensification is one of the main causes of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation, where intensification has transformed diverse landscapes into uniform, unbroken terrain managed with large machines and a highly reduced labor force. This has led to a decline in the abundance of biodiversity of natural vegetation and animals. Globally, biodiversity decline is happening as we concentrate our diets on fewer and fewer crops and farm in ways that adversely impact surrounding species, threatening wild ecosystems and biodiversity. So, for example, there is now up to $577 billion in crops at risk every year due to pollinator loss. Relying on highly processed food, the intensive globalized food system is efficient in delivering calories, but not nutrition. So while we have enough food for everyone in the world, about a third of food is wasted, and another third is used for animal feed. And there are also stark poverty divides. So as a result, there are over 800 million people who are food insecure, more than 1 billion people suffering from obesity, and a further 2 billion suffering from micronutrient deficiencies. Instead, a resilient future demands decreased dependence on intensive industrial farming and an increase on reliance on biodiversity that protects genetic diversity, ecological cycles, speeds recovery from natural disasters, provides food security, promotes soil formation and agricultural regeneration, and also maintains natural food chains. This diagram compares agroecology on the left with sustainable intensification on the right, with the darker colors equal to more sustainable food systems. Agroecology and related approaches manage working landscapes for both production and biodiversity conservation, and draw on the knowledge and expertise of communities to secure biodiversity. The farmers who use agroecology and related approaches have been stewards of the land and ecosystems for centuries. They need to be empowered to continue to protect biodiversity, soil, air, and water. We need to recognize their rights, secure their land, and provide them with financial support to ensure they can carry on preserving our collective heritage. Networks such as the globally important agricultural heritage systems can help, but on the ground support is the key. The 500 million small-scale farmers, women, Indigenous peoples, and local communities need our support as they are the true guardians of biodiversity. The targets, goals, and metrics of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework can bring about the quantum change essential to transformation. Thank you, and over to you, Miriam.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Alison, for that great introduction. And thank you, Basile, also for the introduction. I'd like to pick up from what Basile said about the fact that there's a growing chorus of voices saying that food and agriculture need to be transformed. The Global Sustainable Development Report 2019, for example, put forward food systems and nutrition patterns as one of 6 entry points for transformation towards sustainable development. We have a UN Food Systems Summit coming up this year. The IPBES is preparing a report on food systems. So there's growing voices that food systems really need to transform. And yet, and also that biodiversity is definitely a very key component of this transformation. There's a wealth of evidence that biodiversity and ecosystem services are central to cutting down external inputs, delivering resilience, providing a buffer against environmental and economic risks, and enabling adaptation to climate change. However, the Aichi targets, for example, the reports are showing us that we're not heading in the right direction, even though we have all of the right reasons to move towards more biodiversity integrated into our production systems. That's not happening. At IPBES Food, we have come out with a report several years ago on identifying food systems. And in that report, we identified 7 lock-ins to food system transformation. So there are things within our food and wider economic systems that keep us in this place where we know we're doing harm. And I'd like to touch on one of those 7 lock-ins, particularly because when I was looking at the updated zero draft of the Post-2020 Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, I saw that, well, it was interesting to me that agriculture and food systems are not very mentioned. That was interesting. I haven't been following this process very closely, so I just jumped in and looked at the draft. The other thing is that where it is mentioned, there's a target on reducing production gaps by 50%. And I think this focus on production gaps, essentially yields, is essentially, it's one of the lock-ins that we've identified. Measures of success that are too narrowly defined are used by policymakers, also by media and decision makers, to sort of say, oh, look, we're on the right track, yields are going up, we're on the right track. We are not integrating all of the other aspects, the beneficial aspects of biodiverse food systems into how we measure success. So simple yield measurements in small, diverse farming systems don't reflect actual productivity. The polycultures that characterize many smallholder farms in developing countries, which integrate grains, fruit, vegetables, animal fodder, trees, and livestock, generally yield more in aggregate terms than monocultures, even if the yield of each single crop is below that of monocultures on larger farms. From 20 to 60% higher yields have been estimated when all crops are taken into account. It's thought that these diversified systems might be more efficient than monocultures because, for example, they suppress weeds by occupying all available growing space, they reduce losses to pests and diseases, and they make more efficient use of water and light. 2 global reviews found that diversified systems outperformed conventional systems in developing country contexts by as much as 80%. And that's in a context where agroecological approaches are seriously underinvested in. There's very little research, unfortunately, into these. And so just imagine the type of gains that we could make if we actually reoriented public investments and public policies towards these systems. So our current measures of success make intensive agriculture look good and agroecology look like it's underperforming. And these are the measures of success that are influencing policy spaces, obviously including the CBD. In closing, I would just like to say that, first of all, there's no one food system. I think the schema that Alison shared is very, very useful. We mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that there's one food system. There are a multitude of food systems. They overlap, they are interlinked, and they aren't in the way that they integrate biodiversity and the impacts on biodiversity. And we really need these sort of more holistic metrics and indicators to understand which of these systems is beneficial in terms of the values that we espouse. And just to also say that according to the SDGs, we can have it all. We can have security, we can have biodiversity, we can have jobs, we can have it all. But there's recent research showing, policymakers are not really taking up the challenge of dealing with trade-offs. There are multitudes of trade-offs across the SDGs, even within a single goal, like SDG 2 has several trade-offs embedded within it. And instead of really getting to grips with, what do we have to give up? What's more important? Who is going to give up what? Instead, we're still going on this narrow path of saying, we're going in the right direction. And I really think that these very narrow indicators like productivity, I'm not saying that we should get rid of it. Yields are important, but they're the only metric that we're using now, or one of the few that we're using now to assess the performance of our actual systems. So we need to broaden our thinking and also our measurements beyond our economic objectives. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you to both of you. Very interesting and thought-provoking presentation, and I've taken copious notes. Next, I will like to turn our attention to the discussant representing different stakeholders. We will give a short presentation. We are fortunate to have with us today Ms. Tammy Jonas, President of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance and representative of the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, Monsieur Eric Soubéran, Vice President for Nature and Water Cycle at Danone. We were expecting to be joined by Ms. Esther Penunia, Secretary General of the Asian Farmers Association for Sustainable Rural Development, and staff are trying to make those links, but she may not be able to join us at this time. So let's go with Tammy and Eric. Tammy, you have the floor. Looking forward to your views. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Basile, for having me and for making this forum possible where stakeholders could come and share. Can I just double check that the screen is showing now? Can you see that?
Yes, we can see your screen. It's coming.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Presentation mode.
Wonderful. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people in the southeastern state of Victoria in Australia. I think everybody here knows that agricultural biodiversity is disappearing very rapidly as industrial agriculture, forestry, and fishery systems use homogeneous proprietary seeds, trees, breeds, and aquatic species, scientifically bred and genetically modified to include limited traits, which are useful to industry. They're grown in simplified agroecosystems that are heavily contaminated with biocides and other agrochemicals. Today, we've been asked how the GBF can speak to agriculture sectors, and we must understand the fundamental differences between the agriculture of industry versus the agroecology of smallholders.
Tammy, may I just interrupt you for a second? We cannot see your screen now. It's a blank white screen. So maybe you just go to presenter mode and let us see. Yeah, there you go. Thanks a lot. Sorry for interrupting.
So no, that's okay. Can you not see it still?
I can see it now. I can see it now.
Okay.
Thanks.
That's okay. Hopefully that won't be a problem again. Will I just leave it like that? Can you see it well enough?
I can see it. We can see it well enough, but even in the presentation mode, we could see it. It's fine. Yes, this is fine. Thank you.
Okay. So the CBD does not have a long history of consideration of agricultural biodiversity. And of course, nor does the industrial agriculture sector, which has worked for decades to narrow genetic species and ecosystem diversity. In fact, the CBD doesn't have a recognized constituency for smallholders or peasants, even though we are rights holders under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. And perhaps because the convention is constituted by the environment community, it seems it might have overlooked the historical and ongoing role of smallholders in maintaining biodiversity in the 30% of the world's land on which we produce 70% of its food. So to consider agricultural biodiversity, we must look at the genetic, species, and ecosystem levels, above and below ground, and in all of the waters of the world. In smallholder systems, at least those that haven't been forced to convert to commodity crops, selling into big markets, the diversity is a given. It feeds, clothes, and provides shelter and medicine for families and communities. It's nurtured for its cultural and spiritual values, and it provides ecological and economic resilience. I wanted to share some thoughts from some of my comrades in IPC. Gisela from Mexico says, biodiversity is all the plant species, animals, and sentient beings that exist, which make up the life of a space. It is the connection with the energy of Mother Earth that sustains, feeds, and encourages us, where we are unity with all this living energy, which is why we must love, honor, and defend it. because it's in our historical past and the construction of our future. Atun from Guatemala says, biodiversity is the beginning and end of life. It is a relationship of natural elements that coexist in the territories as part of a biocultural space. They have a cycle of adaptation linked to climate, time, and culture. And above all, agricultural biodiversity preserves a historical memory. It is a millenary inheritance of our ancestors. And finally, Alicia from Mexico also says, for me, biodiversity means a space of life, culture, harmony, and identity between Mother Nature and human beings, respecting and protecting all that is found in it. On my own farm here in southeastern Australia, we raise heritage breed large black pigs and speckle-line cattle on pasture. We've built a butcher shop on our farm where we transform carcasses into a range of fresh cuts, small goods, and charcuterie. Bones that remain after we've processed them into soup stocks are pyrolyzed to create bone char, which is then activated in barrels of microbial-rich biofertilizer and used to grow our small commercial crop of heritage variety garlic and a diverse range of heritage vegetables to feed the community on our farm. Like millions of other smallholders around the world, we're maintaining biodiversity at the genetic, species, and ecosystem levels. Living a life made in common with nature, we conserve and sustainably use the biodiversity in our care. And as non-Indigenous Australians, we have chosen to share the benefits of our use with the First Peoples by paying 1% of our income to a local Indigenous organization. I could offer you a biodiversity framework written entirely by peasants and Indigenous peoples, but time here did not allow. So instead, I offer 2 suggestions. On Target 9, we recommend shifting from the focus on productivity, as Mariam has already mentioned, to a transition to agroecology. And we suggest the following. By 2030, conserve and enhance the sustainable use of biodiversity in agricultural and other managed ecosystems as a means to increase their sustainability and social and ecological resilience, as well as the availability of healthy, nutritious, and culturally adequate food by supporting systems that use native seeds, landrace varieties, and breeds, as well as agroecological production, particularly those managed by smallholders, increasing the area dedicated to these systems by at least 100%, and decreasing the area dedicated to genetically uniform production by at least 50%. And for Target 10, we suggest by 2030, increase by at least 70% the area of ecosystems in areas managed under ecosystem-based approaches, not nature-based solutions, which has no definition, relevant to the restoration and protection of ecosystem functions, particularly clean water provision and reduction of soil erosion. I'd just like to finish by saying that we all know, everyone here knows the urgency that we face to halt the loss of biodiversity facing the world today. But it's critical that we also recognize the unique role of small-scale food producers in the conservation, management, and sustainable use of biodiverse ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. That's really interesting. I'd like to now give the floor to Eric Soubéan, Vice President for Nature and Water Cycle and Chief Sustainability Officer at Danone. And he's also the CEO of Danone Ecosystem Fund. Eric, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you, Basil. Thank you for your kind invitation. And it was really fascinating to hear the previous speakers. Tammy, I think, thank you, Tammy, to put at the center of the discussion the fact that we inherited only Earth and we are there to steward it for the next generation. And I think biodiversity is about this link between generations. And I think this is very much essential. And I was very moved by the citations that you have put on your presentation, because we all have a link with biodiversity. We are part of the biodiversity of the world. And it's clear that unfortunately, we have, by the super linearization of the food system, created a system that right now is indeed broken and is killing biodiversity. And in a way, we have removed consumers and citizen consumers out of the system in a very, I would say, non-natural way. To an extent where some of the young consumers now, the young people who are eating food, don't understand where the food is coming from. When you see that the majority of school kids don't understand that bacon is coming from pigs, or that French fries are made of potatoes, there is a real issue, and that potatoes is coming from earth and is a tubercle. That's a real problem. And I think it starts, this acculturation from is a systemic acculturation, and that's also where the food system is broken. The food system is also broken when you look at it, and I want to also mention that on the fact that we and when I say we is the system, but also the companies, and I'm representing a large multinational in food system, and this is why I'm saying that we are accepting that 30% of what we produce is wasted, which is really a problem for the efficiency of the system, and at the end a problem for biodiversity, because if you keep the system as it is, this is increasing the linearization and the inefficiency of the system. So as far as Danone is concerned, we acknowledge the fact that we are been part of this linearization, and we are now very committed into changing that for many years now by embracing what we call agroecology, or we call it regenerative agriculture strategy. We have been developing this strategy with three main pillars for us that is very concretely now deployed in our footprint. First is to put back soil at the center of our agriculture systems. And this is very important because everything starts from soil. This is our lifeline. This is why we are promoting agroecological or regenerative practices, changing the tillage strategy, the crop rotation strategy in our footprint, and investing a lot in that regard. If you take, for instance, the US, we have now reached about 82,000 hectares of land transformed into regenerative agriculture. We can say it's small, but it's already a lot, actually, compared to many players. It's 5 times the size of Manhattan. If you take in France, for instance, we have committed to transition all our agriculture footprint to 100% of regenerative agriculture by 2025. So our transformation is ongoing, and we're going to accelerate that transition. And the second pillar for us is very important, is animal welfare. We are absolutely convinced that in a circular agriculture system, you can find, especially leveraging the power of grazing, ways to develop smallholder farming practices that are regenerative with the right way to manage animal husbandry in this system. And the systems we have in Europe with small farms, also in Africa with small farms, are basically showing that. And finally, for us, the third pillar is what we call generations of farmers. It is very important for us to maintain a direct contact with the farming world. And we are, as a company, promoting a direct sourcing strategy for all our key agriculture components. Because this direct contact is absolutely essential if you want to transform the system. And I'm saying that because I think fundamentally, yes, protecting biodiversity is on one side, protecting a certain area of lands, the famous 30-30-30. But then if you want to feed 9 billion people, you need to change the system in the way it's operating, in reducing its inefficiencies related to food waste, but also in making sure of how do you want to preserve the land that you're going to use. Because a resource is only a resource when it is used. So if we consider land can be a resource, and if we don't want to exhaust that resource and biodiversity, we need to protect it as well. And therefore, that's where the agricultural practices is very important. This is why it's absolutely key that the CBD and the COP this year tackle this issue of agriculture. And my final word is really to say that this transition requires rethinking of the financing of agriculture. It's absolutely key. We need to provide, especially to smallholder farming, and I agree with Tammy there, a new ways of remunerating farming. Farming is not only about producing a quantity of product. It has to be remunerated with the way things are produced, because farmers are the first stewards of agriculture and biodiversity. And therefore, they need to earn living through their stewardship. And that's really a transition that we are putting in place. And with the ecosystem fund, for instance, that you were mentioning, thank you very much, Basile, but with some of our brands like Horizon, for instance, where we are changing our pricing model with our farmers to what we call payment for ecosystem services. And this is, I think, very important to transition there. That's my last word. And there is room for maneuver there. The world spends $1 trillion every year in subsidies for agriculture. What do we want to do with this $1 trillion? What type of system do we want to finance? What type of valorization do we want to give? And this transitioning, we are ready to be part of it, and we are fully committed in this transformation. Thank you very much.
Basil, you are mute.
Sorry, I've done that 3 times. Merci, Eric. Thank you very much, Eric. There's, I think all of you, if I was to take one word, is that notion that Alison gave us as farmers are the guardian of that land. The guardian is a concept we've been using in protected and conserved area and for the engagement of indigenous and local communities. But perhaps the time has come to expand that notion a little bit wider. We are now going to show you on the screen some questions. They'll be in full screen in a minute. And that's how we're turning the table on you. I see at the last count, there is about 270, close to 300 participants. So we're going to ask the question and you are going to answer the question, and we're going to start the dialogue this way. So here they are. How do we ensure that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework speaks to the agriculture sectors, from small to fishholder livestock to big ones, rather than to the environmental community alone? How can the private sector shift away from that mindset? The mindset of protecting the biodiversity is merely a nice to have. How can we strengthen the interdependencies on the food production and consumption pattern in the post-2020 framework? And I note here the comments from Marianne that she could not see the agriculture per se in the system, and she has a point. It is in several places, but not in one. How can the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework influence policy that boosts responsible investment and redirect harmful subsidies? That's a link to what Eric had just told us in support of nature-based solution. What enablers are needed to reap the co-benefits of food system transition that not only support biodiversity, but use is also as a solution? So those are just a few of those questions, but please take a moment, and there are many other questions, but please take a moment to familiarize with those questions and read them. I will now pass the microphone back to Jyoti, and Jyoti will help us moderating the discussion. Jyoti, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Basil, and thank you so much, Mariam, Tammy, Alison, and Eric. You all have made such important points, and one of the IPLCs of community farming, the importance of ensuring that communities are part of all of this is so important. And my favorite is always the $2 trillion of the what Eric just said of the subsidies towards farming and how we manage that. And that's where such immense transformation can actually come into place. And, it's the same with forests. I mean, the subsidies towards deforestation are so much higher than the subsidies towards, the money put towards stopping deforestation. So I think that's one of the key areas that I very personally feel about. But I'm not asked to give my opinion. I'm just here to moderate. So I will let all the participants know that we have two ways for you to interact with the panelists. You can either take the floor and ask your question within 1 minute, please, because we would like to have as many participants ask a question. And so that is one way to do it. And the second way is through a written question, but in the question box. But I do ask you, and I see there are lots of questions already, but I'm going to kind of disregard this. And this is another thing that I have learned, and we will put it in the beginning. When you ask a question, can you please put your name and country, and even if you, an organization, country or organization. I recognize some of the names, but I don't recognize all. We have nearly 300 people online, and I would like to say that I know all of you, but I don't. So if you want to take the floor, could you just put your name and organization or country on the in the question box? And I know some of you have written questions already, but could you also add that? Could you also add your organization or country, because it would be nice. It would be good to know from our perspective, as Basil said in the beginning. This is not a negotiation. This is really a dialogue amongst all of us. So we would like to know who are parties and who are stakeholders. So with that, may I ask you to write your name in the question box and country or organization, so that I can give the floor to the panelists. I also want to tell the panelists that I will take 2-3 questions in one go, and then pass it on to you 5 to respond to as and when as what is appropriate, and then come back to the floor. We have about 1 hour, 20 minutes, which is great. And I'm very happy for once we have more time for question and answers. So I don't see anyone. Oh, here we have somebody. We have Anjana Gassner from ICRAF. An unfortunate outcome of segregating conservation in wild areas under Goal A from biodiversity under Goal B is that the ministerial mandates are likely to be allocated following this classification. Thus, ministries of environment and forests will continue to deal with protected areas, while ministries of agriculture continue to see their role as managing agricultural diversity for crop and animal production. This will perpetuate the common situation where cross-sectoral collaboration is minimal. Very good point, and I will ask a few more before I give it back to the panelists. Nighat Hasnan, and sorry if I mispronounce anyone's name, from WWF UK. Excellent presentation at ERIC. What metrics do you use to measure ecosystem services? How are they verified? Then we have a question from Francois Pitot from Switzerland. GBF needs to recognize the key contribution of sustainable use of biodiversity to sustainable transition, in brackets, transformation of agriculture and food systems. How to ensure this concretely? I will now come back to the panelists and hope that more people put their names in to ask questions directly from you all. So back to you guys. Who would like to go first?
So do you want me to go first, Jyoti, since I had the pleasure to have the first question?
Yes, please.
There's always a need for a first one, right?
Yes,
So,
there's always a need.
So thanks for the question. So I think it's a very relevant one. I mean, the question of KPI is not an easy one. I think, you know, my conviction very pragmatically is that the way we are approaching that is to take the best available science and systems, and I would say to evolve organically on that topic. So concretely, the way we are approaching in terms of KPIs, we are looking at how we can integrate in the remuneration, for instance, the financing of carbon sequestration in the soil, which is also in itself a debate, but there are methodologies existing now. So we are equipping ourselves to monitor the impact, for instance, of crop rotation changes or tillage changes, and to monitor and calculate the impact on carbon, and therefore remunerate on that sense, because this is an objective we have, is to become carbon neutral, and we are a science-based target company. So this is one example of a way to remunerate. The other way also that we are doing is we have shifted a lot of our systems of remuneration of direct sourcing from, I would say, a global price mechanism to a cost-based approach. So we are working with our farmers on identifying basically the way in the system their cost of production, and negotiating with them or with their representative a safety net, a margin above the cost, that give us room for maneuver and visibility also as well to project themselves and invest. So this is another way to take into account into the system that when you're going to change your practice, you're going to have this safety net of changing the practice, and therefore you can invest into a transitioning system. And so this is two examples of things that we are following. One is I would say a bit extrinsic with the carbon part, and the other is really about how you manage your commercial relationship to offer a certain safety net with your farmers to ensure they can enter into a transitioning. Because I think there are two dynamics always of a change, is how you create the dynamic of change, which is a transitioning part. And the second part is how you make the change permanent. And that's the part where it's not yet easy for us, is to make sure that we are valorizing that in front of our consumers and on the market. And that's an area where with our brands, we are working actively.
Thanks a lot, Mariam, Tammy, Alison.
Yeah, sure. I will try my hand at some of the questions. The first one was about basically environment ministries versus agricultural ministries, and separating their functions and not dealing with each other. And I think that that's a reality in many countries, unfortunately. One note of hope, I think, is that I'm aware that the FAO has recently adopted its own biodiversity mainstreaming strategy. And I think that is a sign that maybe ministries of agriculture in the world will start to take biodiversity seriously, following on FAO's lead, and integrate biodiversity into their own work. But certainly, I think that this interministerial kind of decision-making is really important. I mean, at the end of the day, of course, forests will go to the Ministry of Environment. And of course, you need ministries that are separate. But they need to be talking to each other, and they need to negotiate. And this kind of intersectoral policy-making, there are some examples, of course, successful, but few. And I think that we need to learn from those examples. The one that really is always comes to mind in the area of food security, where I work, of course, is Conceia in Brazil. I think it doesn't exist anymore, I'm afraid to say, but it's had really it's an excellent example of interministerial policymaking with the inclusion of the affected people, which is really important, because in some countries, ministries of environment end up sounding more like ministries of agriculture than, those interests are not necessarily protected in any ministry. So that's just one comment on that. And on the comment from Francois Pitou about sustainable use. I couldn't agree more. I think if you want wording, I think what Tammy shared on her slide was really nice wording. I would start there on her proposed changes. But I would also remind everyone that the CBD has a I don't know what it's, I can't remember a work program, if I'm not wrong, a work program on agricultural biodiversity. And that seems to have been dormant for many, many years. And I think there's a lot of good stuff. I mean, the CBD 10 years and more ago did a lot of work on the ecosystem approach, also with FAO, and how that should apply to food systems. And I think that should be revived. I mean, there are these mechanisms inside the CBD. We don't need to put all our eggs in the basket of the new framework, although of course we should also target the framework. Thank you.
Go ahead, Tammy.
I was just going to respond to the third point by Francois as well about, I guess, shifting subsidies and shifting the way we value agricultural biodiversity to help with the transition. And I think that one of the fundamental things the framework hasn't really got yet is valuing heterogeneity in agricultural systems in the targets. So too often when we talk about biodiversity, and historically it's been discussed as though it's something outside of agriculture. Agriculture happens in a monocultural space, and then biodiversity happens on its edges. And that language, that sort of notion is very old-fashioned and needs to go away. And we need to be thinking of agricultural systems themselves as incredibly biodiverse, and bringing back seed diversity, breed diversity, microbial diversity. And so the targets themselves should be structured in such a way. Some of the wording we've given you there, we have all of the targets written as IPC would like to see them. We could pass them on. Perhaps we'll put them on the IPC website and everybody can see them there. But it does try to do that work of showing the way that you could value heterogeneity and actually also have penalties for too much homogeneous aspects of agricultural systems. And I think if you did that, you'd be doing a much better job. And then I would also just once again reiterate, if you bring your governance down to local level of communities, bring it down so that the smallholders and other community members have a say in how their agricultural systems are being governed, you'll start to see improvements as well.
Sorry, thank you. It's hard to follow up on all the great points that have been made and find something different to say, but I think one of the reasons with foresight that the CBD asked us to talk about the food system is because what it does is it profiles how integrated and integrative food systems are. And it's all about livelihoods, it's all about biodiversity, it's all about human health, it's all about everything that we encounter in our daily lives. And one of the projects that I'm involved in involves city region food systems. And the foundation to that work is building multi-stakeholder engagement platforms so that people can talk across sectors and ministries and understand the benefits that can be realized through regional territorial food system management on the landscape scale, but also the benefits that accrue to smallholder farmers, but also business people, so people who are involved in informal food trading. So I think the more that we can see this as a system and get as many people around the table as possible, and Basil and Jyoti, that's what you're doing here, is you're engaging with more people. And the more voices that sit at the table and enrich this discussion, the more stories we have to share and the more we can learn from each other. And I think that that's really important. And to reiterate what Tammy said, I think it's, and just backing up a little bit, there's $1 trillion if you just take the agricultural subsidies. But if we look at the food system and the damage it does to human health, and we captured that as well, and brought all of that money into a common pool that could be used to protect biodiversity and landscapes and build agroecological and related food systems, I think that there's more than enough money to make it happen. So it's a question of redeploying it. And in terms of how that goes about. I think Tammy's final slide, I think it was, that talked about setting targets in terms of increasing agroecological farmland, which is what Eric and Denon is actively doing, but also reducing the intensive kind of agriculture and getting away from that rhetoric around that's the only way to feed the world, because frankly, it isn't feeding the world right now. So we need to get rid of that idea and recognize where we are and move to a new place.
Thanks so much. I forgot to add that we also have this live webcast through YouTube, and people who wish to ask questions to YouTube, please send them to live@cbd.int. So that I could ask the questions to the panelists. But now I will start with a question from our colleagues at FAO. Kim Friedman says, how can the convention that is typically constituted by the conservation community better bring expertise on productive ecosystems to the post-2020 GBF as active constituents? I'm not sure if this is a question for the panelists or for Basil, but we will see what you guys have to say. I think that we're trying to take the whole of government approach in the framework. So if that really happens, then maybe it's possible. But I will ask you people, to the panelists, to ponder on this. We also have somebody from the live from our YouTube channel, somebody from South Africa called Khalid, who says, what are the panelists' thoughts on the farmer crisis in India, the link to that green revolution, and the forthcoming GMO revolution expected to be accelerated in Africa? I will then turn to a live question from Jinfeng Zhu from the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation. So could somebody open the mic for Jinfeng Zhu so that a question can be asked? Thanks. Hi, is that possible?
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay,
we
good.
can hear you. Yes.
Great. When I was young, Chinese I know all drink soybean milk, but today, every day we drink milk. We eat 10 times more meat than I was young. These changes are good. These changes are not good for our health, are not good for biodiversity. But how we have these changes? Because of food industry, they campaign, they sell, they marketing, they promoting. How could we slow down the industry, the promotion? And we have tried something in China for good food, slow food, local food, and seasonal food. And our company has significant result. So our suggestion is we want input into the framework, HBS, human-based solution. We need to call for people's change. Our lifestyles change, we should change back. We should, that is a great help for the biodiversity. Thank you, my question and my comments.
Thank you so much. I will ask one more question and then turn it back to the panelists. This is from Helena Paul. How can we make mainstreaming of biodiversity across agriculture actually work? What would it look like, and how should this be reflected in the GBF? Helena Paul is from EcoNexus UK. Over to the panelists. How would you like to just leave it to you guys?
I will try and tackle the question about diets, the question from China. I mean, I think that's. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think that's on the minds of. I mean, it's relevant in many countries, not only China. Our diets in many parts of the world for many people are not sustainable, both in terms of how they impact the planet, but also they're not delivering health for us. One of the things that I have found most interesting in terms of how to bring diets back and integrate them more into the ecosystems where people live is the idea of territorial diets. It's a new idea that FAO has written about, but it's something that in Nordic countries has been pursued a lot. And so there's this famous new Nordic diet where they basically got together, experts in agriculture, experts in nutrition, but also chefs and people like that to try to, they came up with a manifesto of principles of how they want people to eat. And of course, it's not a top-down thing. People are still able to eat, imported foods and so on, but there's definitely there's precedence given to organic food, to local food, and especially local food that is in a part of the landscape and a part of the history. So in their case, it can be wild fish, it can be tubers, and then they had the chefs come up with really interesting recipes and making it a more popular thing. And I think the Mediterranean diet has tried to do the same thing. So I think this idea of really actively getting together ministries of health and ministries of agriculture and environment. I mean, I think this is a really unexplored area, even though you hear more and more about diets and food systems. But really, when the Ministry of Agriculture is sitting down to decide its policies, for sure there needs to be somebody from the Ministry of Health to say, look, we have obesity in our country, we have micronutrient deficiencies, and we want to have sustainable diets, which are also supporting the local economy. For some countries, that's really important. So this kind of thinking about territorial diets linked with the territory, linked with local markets, territorial markets, I think is a really interesting way of going forward. But I agree with you that the food industry definitely influences a lot the policies, and it's really difficult. But I think this is a positive way of sort of saying, look, we want local biodiversity. There are national food-based dietary guidelines which integrate local biodiversity into the nutrition advice that countries give. In some countries, they have specific dietary guidelines for indigenous peoples based on local indigenous fruits and vegetables. So reconnecting ourselves with the landscapes where we live, I think, is a really important thing. In terms of mainstreaming biodiversity, what would that look like? I think that would look like agroecological landscapes with plenty of smallholders working in them. Again, I think that for more precise wording, I think that Tammy has done all the work in advance for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariam. Alison, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mariam, for those great comments. I think that there are examples. So you mentioned national food guidelines, eating guidelines, healthy diet guidelines, and I think those are really important. I think that labeling, Chile had a great example with a previous government of how labels were developed to talk about the relative processed or lack of processing in food. There's also, again, Brazil, the initiatives there in terms of integrated governance, but also working to provide public procurement mechanisms. I think that's a lever that governments have that they can use to purchase food that meets certain requirements, and they can set their own benchmarks. In Canada, where I live, one of the provinces has tried to do that. And also, there are very good examples of government regulations, for example, for children with different kinds of food. So again, in Canada and Quebec, there are very strict guidelines about marketing certain kinds of foods to children. And that's an idea that, that seems to work, and it could be expanded in different ways, depending on, so that there could be a link between biodiversity, territorial food systems, and encouraging people to eat from their food sheds. And I was just, and in terms of the farmer crisis in India and the Green Revolution in Africa, I think these need to be, we need to tell the story of what the ramifications of adopting that kind of agricultural system will be. And I think that that's what is sort of, if we look at Europe and the intensification and what kind of landscapes that's led to, I think that that's a very good example of how you can go in one direction and the impacts of that, and how the landscape is radically different from the way it was 1,000 years ago, and the impacts on biodiversity, and ask ourselves seriously if that's the direction that we want to be going in, increasingly in Africa and also in India, and the implications of privatizing and taking away the collective bargaining or the collective cooperative movement within India, so that farmers don't have the capacity to protect themselves and their livelihoods. So all of these are interconnected. Again, it's a food systems question, and it needs to be addressed by many different people sitting at the table.
Thanks, Alison. Tammy and Eric, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I would love to just add to reiterate really what Mariam and Alison have already said, that I think if you put decision making, you guarantee participation in decision making with Indigenous peoples and smallholders, then that's going to ensure mainstreaming biodiversity across your landscapes, for one thing. And I think that also we wouldn't be seeing the problems we've seen in India if you had proper decision making powers in those communities that are going through such incredible turmoil. And I mean, in terms of a green revolution in Africa, if you stop having major foundations, such as the one everybody here knows drives a lot of the change in Africa, if you took the power out of their hands and stopped giving them a seat, not only with many African governments, but in UN bodies as well, and stop giving them that kind of power at the table, and put it back in the hands of the communities. And I totally agree with Alison also in not letting the stories not be told about where this goes. Ensure that the stories are clear and the pictures are shown of the changes in landscapes and livelihoods.
Thanks so much. Eric?
I think it's a very broad question, so I can only be humble to answer that. Of course, there need to be a rebalancing of the food diet. On the other end, we cannot ignore that despite all the limitation and impact that are extremely negative of the green revolution, there has been some positive also to nourish the planet. So I think we need to relocalize food system. That's very sure. We need to rebalance food systems as well. That's absolutely key. I think we need to make sure we create food systems that are circular. As I said, I think animal protein has a place in the food system, but we need to make sure the place is well defined. Because I am a farmer myself, and we have other farmers. We know that, for instance, animal protein provides a regular source of revenue for farmers, especially milk. And this is making the whole difference when you manage a food system, also in terms of resiliency. And if you manage well grazing systems, this is fully compatible with planetary boundaries. Many scientific studies are showing that. So I think it's all indeed a question of balancing. where I think it is difficult to rebalance people's diet if we don't tackle another topic, which is what is an unviable future for people. And I think if people, and I think it was very eloquent in how our Chinese colleague was saying that, you know, so this transformation is, of course, because the offer has been pushed to the consumers, but it's also because the social consensus is that an unviable future is this one. And it is not unviable, we know. So what alternative that is unviable can we propose to our kids? And I think that's a collective responsibility. This is why we need political consensus in the noble way. This is why things like COP biodiversity are so important, because it's not only about regulating, it's not only about limiting, it's also about creating incentivizing systems for people to transform. And human beings are never better than when they are creative, efficient, innovative, and not constrained and limited. So, and I think this is how a policy that can promote and I think one thing that is good with biodiversity, this is the point I wanted to make. Biodiversity is one of the only sustainable topic where it's about more. It's not about less pesticide, less carbon in the air. It's about more. It's about more diversity, more hybridation, DNA divergence to create life. So, and this is extremely powerful, even for corporates, actually, because when you think of a brand, by definition, a brand looks at differentiation, right? So I think there is something behind the very core concept of biodiversity that is very powerful and that we need to size if we want to create this unviable future. So that's my opinion. I'm not saying it's easy, but I already see a huge potential. And this is, for instance, why in the coalition we have developed 2 years ago called One Planet Business for Biodiversity, this logic of enhancing portfolio diversity is one of our pillars, because we are firmly believing that this diversity topic can create value, growth, innovation, and that's what we're seeing, for instance, with our plant-based business, some of our brands like Silk or Alpro in Europe. So there is really a untapped opportunity here that can be synergistic.
Thanks so much, Eric, Alice, and Mariam. I think that this is so important, what you all have been saying. And one of the things that I find very interesting is that we have this bunch of people here on a panel, and everyone is interested to participate. I was there in as part of the discussions in 2010 at Nagoya, and this group would not have met at that time. So I think that 10 years, despite the fact that we haven't met the Aichi targets and all of that, what we can say is that there is a higher interest and an awareness that we all have to work together to get somewhere for the planet, and not to get to an unviable future, but a viable future for all of us. So I'm really, really glad that we are able to do these kind of things. Now, I have two comments. One is that I love my voice, but I would prefer people to actually ask their own questions, and that I don't have to read out questions for everyone. So please remember that you can put your name in and ask a question yourself. The second is, as the one thing that we have learned in this last year is that we have to adapt at all times. So I am very, very happy and glad to now say that Ms. Esther Penunia from the Asian Farmers Association for Sustainable Rural Development has finally been able to join us. And I'm so glad that you were able to join us, and welcome. And I give you the floor for a few minutes to say a few things. Thank
you. Thank you, Jyoti. I'm really very sorry. I had an internet glitch in my place. Maybe the main switch was something bad happened, and it only came back like just when I was about to join. So I'm from the Asian Farmers Association for Sustainable Rural Development. We are an alliance of 22 national farmers organizations in 16 countries, and we have a 6-point peasant agenda which unites us, and one of that is promoting agroecological, integrated, diversified approaches in farms, fisheries, and forests. And we know that biodiversity is very important and valuable for us, because as we have learned from our various practices on agroecology and integrated diversified organic farming systems, biodiversity will increase our resilience on pests, diseases, climate change effects, fluctuations in prices, and therefore help us have more stable incomes, as well as provide for food, health, beauty, and nutrition. Okay. So I was asked to name 3 enablers, and I would like to get this opportunity to recommend 3 enablers. I know that I've listened to the conversation before joining, and Tammy and Mariam have somehow, I think, said this. But the first enabler to scale up and scale out agroecological practices and promote agrobiodiversity is the empowered agency of small-scale family farmers, fishers, livestock breeders, forest-based producers, and pastoralists, because this agency of farmers can consolidate the voices of their members, can strengthen the capacities of their members, can help the members engage in more production, in more value processing, in engaging the governments for the policies that they want to promote biodiversity. So direct financing to producer organization, like for example, what IFAD, GASP, FAO, and FAO are doing with affirmative actions for women who work 80% of the amount of work in the farms. This will greatly strengthen this agency of farmers. Second, I also heard about policies, and one of the enablers we think is a set of aligned and coherent whole of nation, you said, aligned set of policies and programs that directs funding and investments and research to incentivize and support agroecology and integrated, diversified organic farming systems. And third is, a third enabler is the multi-stakeholder partnerships and the inclusive governance that treats farmers, fishers, pastoralists, forest dwellers as not as beneficiaries but as equal partners. So we maybe guidelines, for example, from development partners and donor agencies, that programs are to be implemented in a multi-stakeholder approach with farmers and fishers sitting there in the policy making table or in the steering committee or in the management structures, so that their voices are heard, their recommendations are heard, and there is an increase of stakeholdership and ownership in the process of all these biodiversity practices and systems that the government might want to do in the process. Thank you very much, Jyoti, for giving me this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Esther. And we're so happy you were able to join. These glitches happen all the time. Just as I was about to take over the moderation, my computer started doing some funny things, and I was getting very nervous that I won't be able to continue. So thank you very much. Now, may I ask Emile Frisson from IPES Food, Italy, to ask a question. Emil, you have the floor. Nancy, were we able to give the floor to Emil?
I am giving the floor to Emil. I think his microphone is muted.
Oh, now I can. Yeah. Okay. Sorry for
Perfect.
this.
No problem.
Yes, I think we have heard a lot about the role of transitioning and transformation of our food system, applying really diversified agroecological systems to achieve multiple purposes. What we have not maybe tackled enough is the aspect and the role that is played by diversified agroecological systems in the in agricultural systems. Actually, there is probably more biodiversity present in managed ecosystems than in protected areas. And we really must start paying more attention, and transformation of agriculture is really essential to that. So I think we should also be introducing this aspect into target 1, and not target 1 for the moment is only addressing protected areas. And I think we should really add a sub-item in there to, or give more visibility at least, to the importance of diversifying agricultural systems for conservation. So my question is, how can we do that?
Thank you so much. I will now ask a question that came through YouTube from Uganda. Many times agroecology is promoted contrary to our agricultural transformation agenda. Let's promote agroecology to coexist with appropriate innovative conventional systems. I will now give the floor to Lee Lim. Joyce, could you give the floor to Lee Lim so that she could ask a question?
Thank you very much, Jyoti, and to all the speakers. I'm Lim Ching from the Third World Network. I agree very much with what the speakers say that Target 9 in the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework should call for a substantial increase in the land area under established agroecological production and as practiced by small farmers and small producers and IPLCs, particularly women. Of course, concurrently, their participation in decision-making and their rights over resources, including for land and seed, need to be fully ensured and well reflected in Target 20. I'd like to ask a question with regard to the issue of industrial agriculture, because as we know, it best identifies land use change for agriculture, particularly industrial agriculture, as a major driver of biodiversity loss. How do we ensure that Target 17 ensures that the perverse incentives that have kept industrial agriculture in place are dismantled so that we can move out of conditions that lock in industrial agriculture and prevent agroecology from scaling up and scaling out? And at the same time, how do we ensure that in Target 18, resources are mobilized and directed to IPLCs and small farmers, particularly women who practice agroecology, and to ensure their rights? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Leland. So Barbara from Uganda had asked the question that I just asked through the live at cbd.inc, but now I see that she is online. Would she like to add something? Barbara, would you like to add something? Joyce, could we give her the floor in case she wants to add something else? In the meantime, maybe I could ask you a question from Roberto Azo. Sorry?
Jyotina, I just want to react to the gentleman who intervened. How can we accelerate? I think for me, one of the key elements of acceleration, I think we need to derive. I think there is one element that I think is very key. We need to make sure that natural capital is considered as a real asset, and I think. And it is, and that's the very paradox in which we are, is we are using an asset as a resource, but we don't pay for the assets we use. We pay for everything else, transport, energy, waste, as we said, but you don't pay for the capacity of the system to regenerate the assets and to protect it for future generation. So, and I think one way to change the system at scale, to answer this gentleman, and sorry if I forgot your name, is really that. And as soon as you will consider nature as a natural asset, the fantastic thing with biodiversity is that when you protect biodiversity, this is a positive feedback loop. So you are not depreciating what you're doing, you're appreciating over time. So you're creating more values. And so there is a huge potential, even financially, to consider nature as an asset to create value for the world. And I think there is, if we have finance experts around this virtual call today, there is a lot of things to invent there. That is extremely enthusiastic, and that could be a way to fundamentally change the way we are remunerating agriculture. And when I was mentioning stewarding agriculture as a stewarding of natural asset, this is really what I mean. It's not only about producing producing agriculture commodities that, by the way, we see that they are not commodity anymore, because sometimes they're getting scarcer and scarcer. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, Jyoti.
Not at all. Not at all. This is a conversation, so it's really great that you respond when you do. Does anyone else want to respond? And before I go and ask more questions, Tammy, you have the floor.
Yes, well, it was only a matter of time before, Eric and I were going to have to disagree on something. So I think that while there is, obviously it's a complex topic, the valuing of ecosystem services and natural capital, but I would disagree that it's the solution to the problem. I think I'll give a very concrete example. The valuing of water in Australia has led to the absolute disaster of water use in this country, because it's now traded on an open market like a commodity. And so the people who most need access to that water don't have access to that water. So while I agree that when you think of it in terms of if we put a value on it and then people have to pay for it to the stewards who are looking after it, in principle, this sounds good, but it's not what happens in a capitalist economy. It suddenly becomes a tradable commodity, and we no longer maintain it in the hands of the smallholders. So I don't actually think that that's the solution to the acceleration. I think that accelerates the loss of control and empowerment of smallholders, actually.
One thing that could be considered as an alternative to that is charging the real cost of using the natural resources and putting that money back into the hands of people who are being stewards of the land and supporting them. So for agricultural production that's degrading biodiversity and that's degrading water quality and soil, there can be measures put in place that instead of incentivizing that, we would, as Tammy was saying in her presentation, we would incentivize the opposite. So there would be an opportunity for people to be to expand their land, and the stewards of the land in terms of agroecology would be compensated for that. The genuine stewards of agroecology would be compensated for that.
I
just want to just answer to Tammy, because my point was not about valuing the point is, if you consider nature as an asset, what you are remunerating is the protection of the assets and its capacity to regenerate. So it's fundamentally different from the example you were taking about the water rights, because water rights is about capping systems and or a right for pollution. So I think it's probably not the place, but as long as you consider nature as an asset, your interest is to make sure this asset is protected long term. That's the big difference from a trading mechanism. So and there is no market today that is considering nature as an asset.
I won't come in on this one, but just something that Alison said made me think that I can see, I've been working in this field for 20 years, I can see slow changes of topics coming to be more discussed, more debated. Food systems now is on everybody's minds. Biodiversity increasingly. I was thinking of, there was a comment about perverse incentives and what do we do about them? And I think that, I think even also there, it's slowly, as the public starts to understand more and more the immense scale of these subsidies that's going to agriculture, this can also change minds. But the thing that comes to my mind now is that all of these changes that we talk about, all of these changes that we work for in our policy spaces, and they're slow in comparison to the scale of the problems that we face, no? And I think that's a real problem. I mean, yes, we can bring the topic of true cost accounting eventually onto the agenda of the UN. For sure, we will be able to do it one day, but maybe in 50 years, because the pace of opening up to new discussions is so slow. And I think that that's something that we need to talk about. I mean, I know the UN Food Systems Summit, they talk about disruption and we need to disrupt. And I think they're capitalizing on this sense of, we need to change something really radically, really soon. But the kind of disruptions that many of them are talking about are innovations and technologies that will suddenly change, whole entire political economies. And I don't think that that's the kind of disruption that is necessarily good for biodiversity or for people. So, being careful not to panic and to jump at the newest technology that comes, but at the same time feeling a sense of urgency, And these policy debates are so slow. This is just a feeling that I needed to share.
Thanks a lot. I am now going to give the floor to Basil because he has a question to ask and poke a little bit here in this very interesting conversation that is happening, and just the kind of conversation we wanted. So Basil, you have the floor.
A question to our panelists, but also to the audience. What is a small farmers or a family farm, and how does that extend to larger enterprise? In my country here in Canada, I discovered that most medium and large size farm operation are family owned for several generations. So question back to you.
Thanks. And Esther wants to respond to that. Esther, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Basil, for your question. I have mentioned family farming several times in my intervention, and a family farmer has been defined by FAO as like an agriculture in farmlands, in fisheries, or in forestry that is done by a family, as composed to as an agriculture done by a corporation or by a company. So that's a family farm. So where members of the family help each other in the farm, and most of the time their labor is free, quote unquote. So we know that when we talk about family farmers, the size will vary depending on the size of the land they work on. Now, maybe in your country, there are like a family farmer would have 100 hectares of land, but in Asia, where I come from, the average size of a farm is 1 to 2 hectares. And if you have 5 hectares, you are considered already a big farmer in our country, in our region. So, but still, I think the family farmers as a whole, whether big or small, will have same demands, but also because of the context of the land and the country that they are in, might have also different challenges to face with regards to the politics in the country and also in the economies of the country. Yes.
I would just like to add to that. It's an appropriate question, Basil, I think, because we're in the UN decade on family farming. So it's a good time to understand who family farmers are. There's an estimate that about 90% of all farms, and there's about more than 600 million farms in the world, about 90% of them are family farms. Of those family farmers, the large majority are smallholders, but there are also large ones. So the term family farmer includes both large and small. So we shouldn't really confuse those, even though the vast majority of family farmers are smallholders.
And if I may respond as well. So I think it's also not just the question of whether they're small or big, right? The question that's relevant in this forum especially is about the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And so whether they're engaging in those activities is equally important to me, to whether you classify them as a family farm or a smallholder. And that can be done on large land holdings as well as small. But then there's a related question, I think, about economic systems. And so as we all know, that the definition of a peasant is going to be somebody who has control of their resource base and a level of autonomy from that market, and often in battles with the state, actually. But the commodity selling farmer is going to be in a very different economic situation, and those may be smallholders who have moved to cash crops and they're selling into a commodity market. And in moving to cash crops, they've moved to more monocropping activities because that's what was sold to them as the way to get out of the cycle. So I think it's a very complicated question, and the answer is even more complicated. And so it's what are we trying to do with these definitions? Are we trying to support more people to have control of their resource base and to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity for generations, to come? I mean, just if I may, in terms of family farms, I believe Bill and Melinda Gates are the largest farm owners of farmland in the United States. And if it's a family foundation, does that make them a family farm? So it's just to show how ridiculous the classification might be.
Thanks a lot. So now I'm going to ask another round of questions, and to show that there is interest in this topic, even beyond our biodiversity people, I'm going to ask a question from Roberto, who is from the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock in Costa Rica. He's asked several questions. Do you consider food consumers as part of the solution? How do we involve them? Then he goes on to ask, biodiversity in soil is crucial for productivity, crop health. Tammy, in your experience, what governments have to do to stimulate soil protection? I will then go and ask, some people want to ask a question. So we are going to go to Barbara from Uganda first, and then Anya Gassner from ICRAF. So Barbara, you have the floor. It takes a few minutes to unmute and hear people. So please just have some patience. Thanks. Barbara?
Hello, this is Barbara. I work with the National Agriculture Research Organization here in Uganda. and we are part of the Ministry of Agriculture. I was very interested when Miriam was talking about the two ministries, agriculture and environment, talking. And one of the things that we have been discussing is the issue of the nature and valuing nature. And we are always arguing about, when do you value nature? When are you going to charge someone for using the nature? Do you value the communities that are opening up new lands? Do you value someone who is coming in? So I would like Erica to shed more light on if we are to value nature, when do we do it and who do we charge? Because these are very... Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. Now we could ask Anya. Anya from ICRAF.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the floor. Anya Gassner from World Agroforestry, ICRAF. I would like to bring the discussion back to the question, so how can the new framework actually support governments in bringing the transformational change that we all talked about and everybody very much would like to see happening in the food systems? So Emil earlier alluded to that as well. Both Mariam and Alison talked about, of course, the food system is complex and we need collaboration between ministries, and we have innovation platforms. Now, my question back was, so if we do not recognize that agro-ecosystems have an important role to play in the conservation of wild species, as well as habitat connectivity, and they're not featured under Goal A, you effectively, even though you're not intending to do, you are excluding the ministries of agriculture from actually carrying forward this mandate of biodiversity. As the framework right now is drafted, agriculture is, as Mariam actually pointed out, currently dealt with under Target 9, and it's very clearly linked to biodiversity for food production. It's the ecosystem service function of agriculture. It is not the recognition of agro-ecosystems as part of the asset that we need to conserve. And we have talked quite a lot, you have talked quite a lot about that agriculture is not homogeneous, that there are many different land use systems within agriculture, which would make agriculture productivity a lot more biodiversity friendly. So that needs to be recognized. I would like to get a respond to that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anya. Now I will ask one question to Esther from Ken Mwate. How can countries better align policies and provide incentives for promoting agroecology and agrobiodiversity? Thanks a lot. I'm going to give it back to you, give it back to the panelists. Depending on how long it takes to respond, we may have one more round of questions or we may not. So back to you guys. Thanks.
Yes, so I think there is a question directed to me. So I think a coherent, aligned set of policies that incentivize and support agroecology would mean, for example, policies foremost will be policies to secure rights to lands, waters, forests, and seeds, especially for farmers, for family farmers. And second, also policies about land management and land use, because, for example, in our country, we don't have a policy yet on land use, so that even irrigated rice lands are being converted to housing subdivisions, example, in our country. So also incentives can be in terms of payment for economic services. There will be an incentives for grants, soft loans, or blended finance for farmers organizations who will promote agroecological practices. Also, I think Mariam has said already that there must be like an interagency coordination. For example, in our country, with the Department of Agriculture, Department of Environment Resources, and even the Department of Agrarian Reform, so that their policies do not contradict each other, because we experience that in our country. The policies contradict. So there must be like an interagency coordination or a committee, for example, on biodiversity and food security, so that there is convergence of their policies. Also, a multi-stakeholder approach in implementation, especially with regards to landscape and using a landscape and ecosystem approach, so that when you, for example, have a program, for example, regreening program, it's not only DNR who is involved, but also the agriculture, because the farmers there and the forest dwellers there are to be mobilized, no, and to be empowered in, for example, a regreening program. I hope I answer your question a bit.
Yes, thanks a lot, Esther. Anyone else want to respond to the last few questions that have been asked? Thanks. Alison, please.
Yeah, if I can just interject a very specific example, I think one of the ways that we can recalibrate the system is by doing things like looking at how those subsidies are delivered to the existing system and changing them. So for example, in Canada, the only way people can qualify for subsidies or crop insurance is if they follow conventional agriculture principles and use herbicides, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers. So people who are using agroecological farming do not qualify. So by turning the tables around in a way that allows agroecological farmers to be supported and just have a level playing field with farmers in the conventional or industrial system, I think that would go a long way to shifting things in a more positive direction. And if we took all the money that's available and we distributed it across the 600 million farmers evenly, I think that $1 trillion could help everybody out a lot.
Thanks, Alison. Tammy.
I'll just respond to the soil question about how governments can incentivize better soil management. And I think there are some good, well, first of all, there's the voluntary guidelines on the sustainable management of soil that are actually quite useful, as is the World Soil Charter or the Global Soil Charter. They both have good direction, I guess, for parties to use. And a particularly good local example I know of is the New Mexico Healthy Soils Act, which has, and it's an entire piece of legislation about how to encourage better management of soils. But it also comes down to 5 very simple principles around keeping soil covered at all times, maintaining ground cover, and not using biocides, and so high-level principles, and then some actual legislation behind that I think has led to some improved practices across a landscape that's quite brittle in New Mexico, and soils are easily lost. So I think there are a number of examples of good ways governments can support better soil management. And here in my own state, in Victoria, we won some reforms for the land use scheme for pastured pigs and poultry in 2018. And in doing that, we wrote guidelines about what good management of outdoor pigs and poultry looks like, so that also smallholders don't come into the game when they're new, especially like us. 10 years ago, they don't come in perfectly knowing how to manage their soils. So writing guidelines that helped them understand you want to maintain ground cover at all times, which means moving those animals more often and that sort of thing. So I think government does have a role to play and can be quite positive on soil management.
Thanks a lot. Mariam.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the question on are consumers part of the solution? And I mean, certainly consumers play an important role. We heard about increasing consumption of meat, for example, in China and so on. So it's not that they're not an important player, but I think that I often feel that this focus on consumers diverts the attention away from the focus on policy, because also consumers act and make their choices in an environment which is shaped by policies that determine prices, policies that determine the food environment, health policies, messages, all of these kinds of advertising, to choose one of the most contentious ones. All of these things are the responsibility of regulators, of policymakers, and within that shaped environment, shaped by policy, yes, then consumers, according to their income level and their level of education, they make their choices. But I don't think we should divert attention away from the role of policymakers in shaping consumer choices. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Anyone else has anything to add? Oh, okay. So then I'm going to ask two last questions, and then I will hand it back to Basil. One question is from Sheila Wills from Pan UK in the UK, but working in Benin and Ethiopia with small farmers. Her question is, highly hazardous pesticides. Oops, now my computer has really gone. Highly hazardous pesticides not only destroy biodiversity, but also act as a barrier to the adoption of practices that foster biodiversity. So anyway, the question is about highly hazardous pesticides, and how should we work around them. My computer just died on that particular question, but I had taken a photograph of a question before. So this is from Steve Wells. I'm interested to hear the panel thoughts on how multinational companies from a range of sectors can work together to enable the scale up of better agricultural systems. So these are the last two questions we can ask. If anyone wants to respond, or all, please go ahead.
I can respond to the pesticide question. I think we have a great example. Sorry, is that okay now?
Yes,
okay to go?
Please.
Oh, okay,
yes.
Thank you. Okay. In terms of pesticides, I think we have a great example in terms of the neonicotinoids and the devastation to pollinator communities, and those have been banned in many countries around the world, and there's a long history of doing that. So I think that there's good precedent for making that happen, and that biodiversity is obviously a key part of those legislative decisions. So yeah, there's longstanding precedent for that.
Thanks a lot. Does anyone else want to? Esther, please.
Yes, on issue of the pesticides and also on the fertilizer chemicals. So we think if, for example, a farmer would like to shift to a biodiverse and agroecological organic, one way to do is to do it in transition. Like if you have a 1 hectare farm, so make first your 1/4 of your farm organic, like that, or don't use fertilizer until you can get that 100% of your farm. You do not use pesticides or chemical fertilizer. So that is one way of shifting to organic. But then incentives to do that will be needed, because when you shift to biodiverse and not do chemical fertilizer, when you are used to that, it will mean some losses for you in maybe 1 or 2 or 3 cropping cycles.
Perfect. Does anyone else want to respond, or maybe say some last words before we hand it back to Basil? Alison, would you like to say some last words before we hand it back?
Yeah, I can't remember who put this on the table, but I think it's really important to reiterate the potential for integrating agroecology into many more dimensions of the post-2020 framework. And I think that we've heard many excellent suggestions, some very specific, some more general today about how to do that. And I think that it could really help to move us in the direction of creating those multi-stakeholder conversations that we absolutely need to realize this. It brings all the players to the table in terms of the farm, smallholder farmers, and all the other people that need to be talking from the government point of view. So yeah, I think that that's my takeaway for today.
Thanks a lot, Alison. Eric, do you want to, you have a few last words to say? Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have discussed a lot, and rightfully so, the regulations and the need for a framework. I think we should also, and I think we should not forget that there is a movement out there and that we can also create incentive mechanisms. I think it's not all about constraining, limiting, stopping, blocking. It's also creating a change. And I think we need acceleration if we want to make things happening in the next 9 years. And I think this is not the same muscles. And I think I can take a very simple example. If you take, for instance, the climate topic, the potential of carbon sequestration. This cannot be incentivized by carbon taxes, because what you need is more sequestration, is not less emission. You need both, actually. But to limit emission, yes, you need to curb the emission. But if you want to accelerate the carbon sequestration, you need incentivizing this change. And I think it's very important to look at both. And I am convinced that the citizens, consumers, when they choose, they vote also, at least in certain part of the world today, for the world they want to live in. And I see these trends accelerating, and we need to encourage this acceleration. So I want to be a bit positive also at the end of this conference, because I see we have potential to get the acceleration, and we have possibility to create this movement. And my colleagues today, I'm sure, are very good example of how this movement can be structured.
Thanks a lot. And actually, we should be moving towards regeneration and not just curbing loss. So I agree with you completely. Tammy and Esther, do you have a few last words?
I feel like I should leave Esther the last word since she was the last to arrive. So I'll just be very quick and let Esther have our final word. I would simply, I guess, say again, I think that the changes lie with more democratic control of the system and more localized decision making. So more decision making power in the hands of Indigenous peoples and smallholders, and the communities that they exist in. And it's interesting, Eric. I don't think of them as curbing, but I guess I've never been an industrial farmer either, so I'm not on the side of a desk where they feel like they're being told what they can't do when it might hurt their livelihood. But the choice to be on the agroecological side is one that I certainly experience as radical abundance, even though it is a much more frugal lifestyle than some of my industrial counterparts. And so I think if we can highlight the abundance for ourselves and everyone else, if we all stop taking more than our share, then that would be great. Hopefully that's my last words. Positive enough?
Yes, and you're making me want to be a farmer like you, but I wouldn't know what to do with if I was on a farm. Like, Eric said in the beginning, we're so far apart from our food system. Esther, you have the last word.
Yes, thank you. So in our experience, when a farmer is able to become aware of the benefits of an integrated, diversified, organic farming system or agroecological approaches, and they have the kind of support and incentives, they immediately adopt it because they know it is valuable for them in terms of income, food security, health, and nutrition. So with the millions of small scale family farmers, as Marian said, as much as 80% of family farmers are small scale. With them being empowered, with them having the agency, with them being supported, I think we will have the solution for a massive scaling up and scaling up of agroecology, biodiverse system in farms, fisheries, and forests. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Eric, Esther, Alison, Tammy, and Mariam, who had to unfortunately leave a few minutes earlier. This has been a very stimulating conversation, and thank you for letting me moderate it with you. With that, I will hand it back to Basil. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, everybody. I will do that very, very quickly. I've jotted down 5 ideas on my notebook as I was listening to the question and the answer. And they're not meant to be exhaustive, but that's the one that stuck with me. The first one is defining the future we want, and defining what the world we want to move to. And that is not the first time I hear that. That is the first time I hear this from this crowd here, and that stuck with me. The second one is, how do we manage that change? I heard some people talking about regulation. I heard some people talking about nudging and winning the hearts of the people and maybe their belly or their stomach. That would be my crowd here. And then after that, I heard 3 specific ideas. One is around understanding that the farmers are the guardians of that land and they have a role to play and need to be responsibilized in the stewardship. The second one of those tools is enabling finance, enabling public finance, but also enabling private finance and private investment in terms of ensuring that the appropriate information is there. And then lastly, I was intrigued by the notion of integration through the dietary guidelines and how you bring health officials together with environment and agriculture to have a conversation. So, dear participants, dear colleagues, that's the end of the webinar. I want to express my thanks to you, the participants, to all of you. There was about 260, and then to the panelists, and to the Secretariat for organizing this. I sincerely hope that you feel your voice has been heard and you can benefit from the discussion. I certainly did, and I learned how little I know, so I'm humbled by the knowledge of the panelists. And Francis and I would like to thank you for your participation today. I will remind participation that we will be writing a report, and that report will be made available over the next few weeks on the Stakeholder website. So once again, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. And I'll close this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you all.